In every corner of America's history, there runs a quiet, unspoken truth, one that tells of perseverance, hope, and a relentless struggle for fairness. Despite generations of resilience and hard work, millions of Black Americans continue to face invisible barriers built long before they were born. It is not about a lack of effort or ambition. It is about a system that was never designed to let everyone win. From the plantations of the 1800s to the boardrooms of today, the story has evolved, but the weight of inequality still lingers. Imagine working twice as hard, saving every dollar, and still finding the doors of opportunity closed, not because of your choices, but because of the color of your skin. This is not just a history lesson. It is a reality that echoes in modern life, shaping neighborhoods, job opportunities, and the ability to build generational wealth. For centuries, laws, policies, and unwritten rules have created an economic maze designed to keep Black families from advancing. Land ownership was stripped through legal loopholes, homes were denied through redlining, and careers were limited by buyers that hid behind polite smiles. Even today, the effects are clear, a racial wealth gap that refuses to close, no matter how much effort is poured into the dream of equality. But behind this injustice lies something more powerful, the unbreakable spirit of a people who refused to give up. Communities built from nothing, businesses rising from discrimination, and movements that turned pain into power. This is not just a story about what was taken away. It is about what could still be reclaimed. It is about uncovering the truth of how we got here, so that we can finally change the path ahead. In this video, we will journey through the hidden structures that shaped the economic struggles of Black America, from stolen land and housing discrimination to modern-day financial traps. And more importantly, we will explore the solutions, the courage, and the hope that still burns bright within every person fighting for fairness today. Because understanding this is not just about history, it is about the future. It is about recognizing that progress does not come from silence but from awareness and action. If you believe in justice, equality, and the power of truth, then you are in the right place. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to support stories that matter, stories that reveal the truth behind the headlines. Celebrate resilience and inspire real change. Together, we can help rewrite the narrative, one story, one voice, one act of awareness at a time. The story of how Black families lost their land is not just a chapter in history, it is a quiet tragedy woven into the very soil of America. After the Civil War, when freedom was finally declared, land was supposed to represent a new beginning. For formerly enslaved people, land meant independence, dignity, and the power to shape a future beyond survival. Across the South, freed families cleared forests, built homes, and cultivated farms with their own hands. For the first time, the promise of ownership felt real. Land was more than dirt. It was legacy. But as the decades passed, that promise began to erode, replaced by laws and loopholes carefully crafted to reclaim what had been earned. By the early 20th century, Black Americans owned more than 14 million acres of land, a staggering accomplishment considering the odds. Yet within a few generations, over 90% of it was gone. The loss did not happen through open theft or violent raids, as in earlier centuries. Instead, it came through the slow, calculated machinery of legal manipulation. One of the cruelest tools was something called heirs property. When a Black landowner died without a formal will, often because they could not afford legal counsel, the land was automatically divided among all their descendants. Each heir technically owned a fraction, even if they never lived on the property or paid taxes. Over time, as families grew, ownership became scattered across dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people. All it took was for one distant relative to sell their share to an outside buyer, and that buyer could legally force the entire property into a court-ordered sale. This was how speculators, developers, and sometimes even local officials quietly stripped families of their inheritance. It was not just a legal trick, it was an economic ambush. A grandmother who had lived on the same land for 50 years could wake up to find a notice of sale nailed to her door. The property auctioned off before she had a chance to fight. The courts rarely sided with those trying to keep their homes, especially in counties where judges and lawyers had deep ties to the very developers seeking the land. These families were not only losing property, they were losing their history, their security, their proof that generations of sacrifice had meant something. Then came the burden of taxes. Property taxes were often manipulated in ways that targeted poor black communities. Land values were inflated to levels far beyond their real worth, leading to unpaid bills and eventual seizures. Sometimes, the tax notices were intentionally sent late or not at all so the land could be declared abandoned and sold to the highest bidder. In rural Mississippi, Alabama, and the Carolinas, entire black farming communities were dismantled this way. An acre here, a field there, until the vast green tapestry of black ownership faded into memory. These were not isolated incidents. They formed a pattern that stretched from the early 1900s into the modern era. Between 1910 and 1997, millions of acres once held by black farmers vanished. In places like Mississippi, the losses were worth billions in today's currency. Yet the deeper loss was invisible: the erasure of generational wealth that could have paid for college educations, launched small businesses, or provided stable homes for descendants who instead faced poverty. Land, after all, is the foundation of economic power. When you own it, you can borrow against it, build upon it, and pass it down. When it is taken, every future built upon it crumbles. Behind the statistics are stories that rarely make it into textbooks. A farmer in Georgia who grew cotton on his grandfather's fields saw the county take the property after a clerical error in a tax bill. A widow in Louisiana lost her home when a corporation bought her nephew's tiny share of inherited land and forced a sale. A family in North Carolina watched bulldozers tear through their ancestral property to make room for a golf course. Each case might seem small, but together they represent a systematic draining of wealth from an entire people. Even in the North, similar injustices unfolded in different forms. Urban renewal projects in the mid-20th century demolished thriving black neighborhoods under the guise of progress. Families displaced from their homes were rarely compensated fairly, and new developments were priced far beyond their reach. What had once been communities of ownership became neighborhoods of renters, locked out of the very property markets they helped build. The irony was brutal. The land their ancestors cleared and farmed, the soil they enriched, became a commodity traded among those who once denied them humanity. And yet, through all of this, black families continued to rebuild. They found new ways to create stability: churches that doubled as meeting halls, community funds that helped neighbors buy homes, cooperatives that pooled resources to protect small parcels of land. These acts of resilience were quiet revolutions, proof that even when systems conspired to erase their progress, the will to survive and build again never faded. But resilience, as powerful as it is, should never have been the price of equality. Today, the consequences of that stolen land still ripple through time. The racial wealth gap remains wide, not because one group worked harder than another, but because the foundation of ownership was deliberately fractured. When 90% of your community's land is taken through deceptive laws and predatory policies, recovery is not just a matter of effort, it is a matter of justice. And while the faces and methods have changed, the underlying truth has not. Economic power in America has always been tied to land, and those denied access to it are denied the chance to stand on equal ground. This is the untold story of how wealth was drained not by accident but by design, one property at a time. It is a reminder that history's greatest injustices do not always arrive with violence or noise. Sometimes, they come quietly, disguised as paperwork, hidden in the fine print of laws that claim to protect but instead destroy. And when the dust settles, the land remains but the names on the deeds have changed. After the land was stripped away through manipulation and deceit, a new form of control quietly took shape, this time hidden in paperwork, city maps, and the fine print of mortgage applications. It was no longer about seizing land from the hands of farmers, it was about stopping them from owning it in the first place. By the mid-20th century, the Great Migration was reshaping America as millions of black families left the South, chasing the promise of opportunity in northern and western cities. They arrived with hope, with the dream that hard work could buy them a small house, a yard, and the security they had long been denied. But those dreams would soon collide with an invisible wall, one drawn in red ink. In the 1930s, as the United States sought to rebuild after the Great Depression, the government created the Homeowners Loan Corporation to stabilize the housing market. On paper, it was a program to help American families afford homes. In practice, it became one of the most effective tools for cementing racial segregation. Officials surveyed every major city and graded neighborhoods based on perceived investment risk. The highest-rated neighborhoods were shaded in green, the next in blue or yellow, and the lowest, those with black residents or even proximity to them, were outlined in bright red. These red-line zones were labeled too risky for loans. Overnight, entire communities were written off, not for their crime rates or property conditions, but for the color of their inhabitants. Banks and mortgage lenders followed these maps religiously. A black family, no matter how hardworking or financially stable, could walk into a bank with perfect credit and still be told they were not qualified for a loan. The same house, in the same city, would be financed for a white buyer but denied to a black one simply because of where it stood on a map. The red lines became barriers that divided not only cities but destinies. They determined who could buy a home, who could build wealth, and who would remain trapped paying rent for generations. This was not an accident, it was policy. Federal housing authorities encouraged developers to write restrictive covenants into property deeds, legally binding homeowners to never sell to black families. Entire suburbs were built with these clauses, guaranteeing that the dream of suburban life would remain a segregated one. Even veterans returning from World War II, men who had risked their lives for their country, found themselves shut out of the G-Bill's housing benefits if they were black, while white veterans bought homes with low-interest loans and built equity for their families. Their black counterparts were pushed into overcrowded, deteriorating neighborhoods where rent consumed most of their income. The effects rippled outward. Without access to mortgages, black families could not own property, and without property, they could not build generational wealth. While white families watched their home values rise decade after decade, black families were left with nothing to pass down. Children grew up in neighborhoods that were underfunded, overpoliced, and often ignored by city planners. Businesses avoided redlined areas. Schools declined, and public services deteriorated. The map had done its job. It did not just describe inequality, it created. Yet within those red borders, something extraordinary still happened. Communities flourished despite the odds. Black entrepreneurs opened shops, teachers built schools, and churches became the anchors of entire neighborhoods. There was pride, resilience, and creativity in every corner of those red-lined districts. But survival came at a cost. When investment was deliberately withheld for decades, even the strongest communities struggled to thrive. Buildings aged without repairs, streets crumbled, and opportunities grew scarcer with each passing year. As time moved on, The language of exclusion changed, but the outcome remained hauntingly familiar. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement began to expose redlining for what it was: a form of institutional discrimination disguised as economic policy. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 promised to end the practice. But by then, the damage was done. Generations had already been locked out of home ownership, and the wealth gap between black and white families had become a canyon too wide to easily cross. Even after redlining was outlawed, its shadow lingered. Lenders found new ways to discriminate, charging higher interest rates, demanding larger down payments, or steering buyers toward less desirable neighborhoods. The lines may have faded from the maps, but they remained etched in the fabric of American cities. Some of the most striking evidence of redlining's legacy can still be seen today. Drive through cities like Chicago, Detroit, or Baltimore, and you can trace the old maps by sight alone. The areas once marked in red often overlap perfectly with modern zones of poverty and underinvestment. Home values there are still lower, and access to loans is still harder to obtain. Meanwhile, the neighborhoods once shaded green continue to grow wealthier, generation after generation. It is as if those old maps continue to dictate the flow of opportunity long after the ink has dried. For the families who lived through it, redlining was not just a bureaucratic policy, it was a quiet, daily humiliation. Parents had to explain to their children why they could not move into safer neighborhoods, why their schools had fewer books, why the houses just a few blocks away seemed brighter, cleaner, newer. It created an unspoken understanding that the system was not broken by mistake. It was working exactly as intended, and that realization shaped the psychology of entire communities, teaching them that success would always come with barriers others never had to face. Still, there were those who refused to surrender. Activists organized, churches protested, and lawyers challenged discriminatory lending in court. They documented the patterns, exposed the policies, and demanded change. Their work laid the foundation for later generations to fight for fair housing, equal credit, and community reinvestment. Though progress has come slowly, it is built on the courage of those who dared to speak against an injustice that was hidden in plain sight. Redlining did more than draw boundaries. It reshaped the American dream itself. It decided who would inherit prosperity and who would inherit struggle. And even today, the echoes of those red lines continue to shape where people live, how they work, and what future their children can imagine. It is a reminder that the most powerful barriers are often the ones we cannot see, lines drawn not in geography, but in the minds of those who believed equality could be postponed for another generation. Even as the barriers of land theft and housing discrimination reshaped the map of opportunity, another wall stood waiting, one built not of property lines or bank policies, but of perception. It existed in boardrooms, offices, and factories, hiding behind smiles and polite words. For many Black Americans, entering the workforce meant stepping into a space where hard work was never enough to level the field. You could have the same degree, the same skill, and the same determination, yet still find yourself overlooked, underpaid, or dismissed for reasons that were never written on paper, but whispered between the lines. From the moment resumes arrived on hiring desks, the buyers began its quiet work. Studies later revealed what many had long suspected. Two applicants with identical qualifications could receive dramatically different responses, depending only on the names printed at the top. Names that sounded white were far more likely to receive a call back than those that signaled a Black heritage. Behind every statistic was a person, a graduate waiting by the phone, a parent hoping for a chance, a professional who had done everything right yet was told, without words, that opportunity was not meant for them. This silent exclusion was not always intentional. It had been shaped by generations of prejudice, myths, and stereotypes passed down like an inheritance. Yet the result was the same. In countless offices, black employees found themselves working harder just to prove they belonged. Their achievements questioned, their mistakes magnified. Advancement often depended less on ability and more on comfort, the comfort of those who made the decisions. Promotions were given to people who fit the culture, a phrase that too often meant looked like the majority. The effect was cumulative, carving invisible ceilings above those who tried to climb. The consequences of this imbalance rippled far beyond individual careers. When bias limits who gets hired, who gets promoted, and who earns more, it shapes entire communities. Families with lower incomes have fewer resources to invest in their children's education, fewer savings for emergencies, and fewer opportunities to build wealth. It is the same story that began with stolen land and redlined neighborhoods, carried forward into the modern economy. Economic inequality did not end when the maps were redrawn, it simply changed its disguise. Consider the office worker who never receives a raise despite years of excellence, or the engineer whose ideas are praised in meetings only after someone else repeats them. The patterns are subtle but powerful. In many industries, mentorship and networking play a crucial role in advancement, yet those circles often remain closed. Social comfort determines access to opportunity as much as talent does, and that comfort has long been racialized. When decisions about leadership are made in closed rooms, it is easy for unconscious bias to shape who is seen as leadership material and who is not. Even in the face of these obstacles, black professionals have continued to push forward, creating success on their own terms. Entrepreneurs launched their own companies when corporate doors refused to open. Artists and innovators built platforms that bypassed traditional gatekeepers. Activists and educators challenged institutions to see beyond old assumptions. Each act of progress was a quiet rebellion against a system designed to doubt their worth. Yet these victories, however inspiring, do not erase the weight of the barriers still standing. The wage gap between black and white workers remains wide. Even when education and experience are equal, the difference compounds over time. Lost promotions, smaller bonuses, fewer opportunities to invest. Over decades, this becomes another form of wealth extraction, draining potential just as surely as the stolen land and denied mortgages once did. And in workplaces where diversity is celebrated in slogans but not in practice, the struggle continues beneath a polished surface. The exhaustion of always having to prove one's value becomes its own burden. The irony is that these biases harm not only the individuals who face them, but also the society that sustains them. When talent is ignored because it comes in a different package, innovation suffers. When potential is overlooked, progress slows. The true cost of discrimination is not only measured in lost wages, but in lost possibilities, the discoveries never made, the companies never founded, the brilliance never seen. Still, there are moments of change. Conversations once avoided are now finding their way into workplaces. More companies are confronting their histories, tracking pay equity, and rethinking how they hire and promote. It is not enough to simply open the door. The structure itself must be examined. True equality means more than inclusion, it means transformation. It means valuing contributions not because they come from a place of privilege, but because they come from the heart of shared humanity. For those who have lived through this quiet struggle, the fight is both external and internal. To continue striving in spaces that were not built for them requires strength that often goes unseen. It is the strength of walking into a meeting where your presence is questioned, but speaking with confidence anyway. It is the courage to mentor others even when you yourself are denied recognition. It is the endurance of knowing that progress moves slowly, yet still believing in the power of persistence. The story of employment discrimination is not just about bias, it is about resilience. It is about the countless professionals who refused to let others define their limits. It is about generations who turned barriers into stepping stones, who taught their children to work hard not just for survival but for transformation. Yet it is also a reminder that no one should have to work twice as hard to be seen as equal. Equality, after all, should not be earned, it should be given the moment one's effort meets ability. In the grand narrative of struggle and perseverance, the workplace stands as both a battlefield and a promise. It reflects how far society has come and how far it has yet to go. The hope lies in the growing recognition that fairness is not charity. It is justice, and justice, like freedom, is not a gift, it is a right. Long overdue, waiting to be fully realized. Long before skyscrapers pierced the skyline and factories churned with the hum of progress, the foundations of the American economy were built with the sweat, toil, and suffering of enslaved black people whose labor went uncompensated and unacknowledged, yet whose work generated immense wealth for generations of white Americans. Cotton fields stretched across the South like endless seas. The rhythm of the work dictated by overseers and the whip, yet each fiber spun into gold for someone else. Every harvest, every bale of cotton, every brick laid, every road paved became part of a system that enriched some while systematically denying others the opportunity to claim even the smallest share of what they had built. It is easy to overlook this truth when considering the story of modern America. Yet it is impossible to understand the racial wealth gap without confronting the fact that the country's economic engine ran on stolen labor, unpaid and unvalued, a debt accumulated across centuries that remains unaddressed. The promise of freedom at the end of the Civil War offered a fleeting glimpse of restitution. The famous idea 40 acres and a mule, conceived in the post-war chaos by Union leaders seeking to provide formerly enslaved families with a foundation to build their lives, was more than a symbolic gesture, it was a practical step toward reparative justice. Families could have had land, a critical asset, and the means to work it, creating wealth that could pass through generations. Yet, in a cruel twist, the plan was overturned almost as quickly as it was conceived, as political pressure and the assassination of President Lincoln allowed the land to be returned to former slaveholders. Suddenly, those who had endured unimaginable hardships found themselves without the tools to claim a foothold in the very society that had profited from their subjugation. Instead of empowerment, they were forced into sharecropping arrangements that replicated the cycle of dependency, vulnerability, and poverty, often on the same plots they had once worked without freedom. The losses were not abstract. They were tangible, material, and intergenerational, creating a gap in wealth that no amount of hard work alone could bridge. As decades passed, the systemic barriers continued to evolve, taking on new forms that were equally devastating. Policies designed ostensibly to support economic growth, such as the GI Bill after World War II, offered veterans the opportunity to pursue higher education, purchase homes, and start businesses. For white soldiers, these benefits translated into decades of accumulating wealth. Educational advancement and generational prosperity. For black veterans, however, the experience was starkly different. Despite fighting on the same battlefields, returning home to the same nation, many found themselves excluded by discriminatory implementation, racial covenants on housing, and redlining maps that blocked access to loans. Benefits intended as a bridge to opportunity instead became a mirror reflecting the persistent inequities, reinforcing economic disadvantage rather than alleviating it. The contrast between those who could claim wealth-building advantages and those who were denied underscores how deeply policy shaped inequality, creating a wealth gap that did not exist purely by chance or effort but by design and enforcement. Reparations, in this context, emerge not as a radical concept but as a necessary correction, a form of acknowledgement and restitution that addresses both historical injustice and contemporary disparity. They represent more than financial compensation. They are a recognition that a society built on exploitation owes a debt to those whose labor created the very prosperity that continues to benefit others. Discussions of reparations are informed not only by moral imperatives but by pragmatic economics. Closing the racial wealth gap would not only benefit Black Americans but strengthen the economy as a whole, enabling broader participation, investment, and social stability. To imagine reparations purely as charity is to misunderstand their purpose. They are a remedy for inequality intentionally created and perpetuated, a measure of accountability for the systems that denied opportunity and confiscated wealth. The argument for reparations is reinforced by the accumulated economic evidence of systemic extraction. From the unpaid value of labor during slavery to the lost opportunity of land confiscation, discriminatory housing policies, wage disparities, and limited access to credit, Black Americans have been systematically denied the chance to accumulate wealth at the same rate as their white counterparts. These forms of denial were not incidental. They were sanctioned through laws, reinforced by government policy, and facilitated by financial institutions. In essence, the structural disadvantages faced by Black communities were engineered to persist, leaving behind a legacy that manifests in homeownership rates, income levels, access to quality education, and even health outcomes. Reparations, in whatever form they take, whether direct payments, grants for education and homeownership, or investments in communities long neglected, serve as both acknowledgement and action, attempting to rebalance scales deliberately tipped for generations. Critics often argue that too much time has passed for reparations to be meaningful, or that it is impossible to determine who should benefit. Yet when society regularly enacts policies that favor some while limiting others, history becomes a series of interconnected debts and obligations. The wealth accumulated by descendants of slaveholders is directly tied to the exploitation of ancestors, and the economic disadvantages inherited by descendants of the enslaved are the cumulative effect of policies that denied access to land, credit, and opportunity. This is not conjecture, it is documented history, quantifiable in property ownership, income disparities, and access to capital. To ignore these realities is to deny the lived experience of millions and to perpetuate the very inequality that reparations seek to remedy. In recounting this narrative, it becomes clear that the story of America cannot be separated from the story of Black labor. Every plantation, every factory, every infrastructure project, every corporate profit margin built before legal protections existed for Black workers contributed to a system that valued one set of people while systematically excluding another. The denial of 40 acres and a mule and the inequitable distribution of post-war benefits were not anomalies. They were logical continuations of an economic system built to exploit labor and concentrate wealth. To confront these realities is not to dwell on the past, but to understand how history shapes the present and to recognize the interventions necessary for a fairer future. Reparations, therefore, are both moral and economic imperatives. They acknowledge the labor that built a nation, the opportunities denied, and the wealth extracted. They also provide a path toward equity, offering Black Americans the resources and opportunities to close the gaps created by centuries of systemic exclusion. By addressing both historical injustice and contemporary inequality, reparations act as a bridge, connecting the resilience of the past with the potential of the future, affirming that justice is not only a principle, but a practical necessity for a society that claims equality as its ideal. In embracing this path, the nation confronts its history honestly, honors those who were wronged, and lays a foundation for a more just and inclusive economy for generations yet to come. As we arrive at the conclusion of this journey through centuries of systemic barriers and economic sabotage, it is essential to recognize that progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. It demands deliberate action, sustained commitment, and collective accountability. The story of Black Americans' struggle for wealth and equity is not a tale of individual failure or lack of effort. It is a testament to resilience in the face of structures designed to obstruct advancement at every turn. From the confiscation of land to discriminatory housing policies, from biased hiring practices to the denial of access to education and capital, history has repeatedly demonstrated how systems of power can concentrate wealth for some while depriving others of opportunities they are fully qualified to pursue. Understanding this context is crucial, for it frames the work we must do today. Dismantling these systemic barriers is not optional, it is a moral and social imperative. Central to this effort is the acknowledgement that fairness in housing, education, and business opportunities is a prerequisite for meaningful progress. Housing is not merely a roof over one's head. It is the foundation of generational wealth, stability, and community vitality. The lingering effects of redlining, racially restrictive covenants, and other discriminatory practices continue to shape the economic landscape, restricting Black families from accumulating equity and passing down assets to future generations. Addressing these disparities requires targeted policies that not only remove existing obstacles but actively promote investment in historically marginalized neighborhoods. Programs for down payments, housing revitalization, and equitable lending can serve as critical tools to restore balance. But these efforts must be implemented with transparency, accountability, and long-term commitment to ensure they reach those who have been historically excluded. Education, too, is an essential pillar of opportunity and empowerment. Access to high-quality education, equitable funding for schools, and support for historically Black colleges and universities are fundamental to closing the wealth and opportunity gaps that have persisted for generations. By investing in education, society equips individuals with the skills, knowledge, and networks necessary to thrive in the modern economy, ensuring that talent is nurtured regardless of race or socioeconomic background. Furthermore, initiatives such as student loan forgiveness and scholarships for descendants of historically marginalized communities can provide immediate relief while simultaneously fostering long-term economic mobility, allowing future generations to build wealth rather than inherit debt. Equitable access to business opportunities is another critical avenue for progress. Entrepreneurship has always been a powerful means of generating wealth and reshaping communities. Yet Black business owners have historically faced systemic barriers in obtaining capital, navigating regulatory systems, and accessing markets. Targeted programs to provide grants, low-interest loans, and mentorship for Black entrepreneurs can help bridge these gaps, enabling businesses to thrive, create jobs, and reinvest in their communities. When coupled with anti-discrimination measures in financial institutions, procurement, and real estate, such initiatives have the potential to correct decades of exclusion and foster a more inclusive economy. Equally important is the cultivation of collective responsibility. Systemic change is not the burden of a single group. It requires society-wide recognition of historical injustices and contemporary inequities. It requires individuals, communities, corporations, and governments to engage actively in conversations about bias, structural racism, and reparative solutions. Advocacy, civic engagement, and policy reforms must be complemented by cultural shifts that challenge stereotypes, dismantle implicit biases, and celebrate the contributions of Black Americans throughout history. By fostering a shared understanding that economic and social justice benefits everyone, Society can build coalitions dedicated to creating lasting change rather than temporary fixes. The moral dimension of this work cannot be overstated. Reparations, equitable policies, and targeted investments are not mere economic instruments. They are expressions of justice, recognition, and accountability. They acknowledge that the disparities we observe today are not natural outcomes, but the result of deliberate actions and policies that excluded Black Americans from wealth-building opportunities. Addressing these wrongs is essential to restoring trust, fostering social cohesion, and creating a society where the promise of equal opportunity becomes tangible rather than aspirational. It is also important to recognize the resilience, innovation, and contributions of Black Americans despite these systemic challenges. From inventors and entrepreneurs to educators, activists, and community leaders, the narrative of progress is intertwined with stories of determination and ingenuity that have reshaped industries, neighborhoods, and cultural landscapes. Supporting policies that remove structural barriers amplifies these successes, allowing them to translate into sustainable wealth, opportunity, and influence for future generations. As we look toward the future, it is clear that dismantling systemic racism and fostering equitable access to housing, education, and business opportunities is not a one-time effort but a continuous process requiring vigilance, commitment, and collaboration. Every policy enacted, every initiative funded, and every bias confronted contributes to building a society where prosperity is not determined by race, where opportunity is not a privilege of birth but a right afforded to all, and where the promise of justice is realized in tangible, measurable outcomes. In closing, I want to thank you for joining me on this exploration of history, policy, and justice. Your engagement, reflection, and willingness to understand these complex issues are essential steps in shaping a future that values fairness, equity, and human dignity. If this video resonated with you, I encourage you to like, subscribe, and share, helping to spread awareness and foster a community committed to justice and opportunity for all. Let us carry forward the lessons of the past, act decisively in the present, and build a future where the promise of equality extends beyond aspiration to lived reality, ensuring that every individual, regardless of race, has the chance to thrive, prosper, and contribute to a society defined by fairness, opportunity, and shared prosperity.